Silence. A thick, velvety, almost tangible silence, the kind found only in the deepest halls of the great archives. For Arthur Penhaligon, chief archivist of the London Metropolitan Archives, this silence was not a void, but a symphony. He heard the rustle of parchment, the sigh of worn leather bindings, the faint crackle of cooling ink 200 years old. Arthur was a man of order, a man of catalogues and cross-references. His world was neatly shelved, packed in acid-free boxes, and protected from the chaos of modernity by thick brick walls. He was 45, but he looked older. The habit of squinting at the small handwritten font had left deep wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. His whole life had been a service to the past. He did not create history, did not participate in it, he was its impartial keeper, and he was more than satisfied with this. The outside world with its noise, bustle, and unpredictability caused Arthur only dull irritation. Here in his kingdom of dust and memory, he was the absolute master of an ordered universe. Today was not a promising day. Sorting through a box of unclaimed receipts, anonymously planted or bequeathed documents that had been waiting for their turn for decades. Arthur opened another box with methodical precision and came across a nondescript leather diary with no identifying marks. It was completely ordinary, if you don't count the strange, barely perceptible feeling of cold emanating from its cover. Arthur opened the diary and immediately recognized the handwriting. Elias Thorn, his predecessor, chief archivist 30 years earlier. Thorn was a legend, a genius at organizing, but also a man with a reputation for being eccentric. He had mysteriously disappeared one evening, leaving an unfinished cup of tea on the table. The police had ruled it an accident or a sudden escape. The case had long since been closed. The first pages of the diary were exactly what Arthur expected, meticulous entries of receipts, notes on the humidity in the storage rooms. But as he went on, Thorn's handwriting became increasingly uneven, obsessive. He stopped writing about work. All his thoughts were consumed by some fundamental grammar of the world. They think reality is a solid slab, Thorn wrote. Fools, it is fabric, and all fabric has seams, thin decayed places where the maker's needle faltered. I have found references to them in alchemical treatises, in the logs of lost ships, in the suicide notes of mad poets. They are not portals to other worlds. They are places where our own reality is. Out of focus. Thorn was convinced that these seams could be found. He believed that they were not geographical points, but rather conceptual nodes where time and space behaved differently. He was not looking for treasure, power, or knowledge. He was looking for proof of his theory. The last entries were almost illegible, full of feverish excitement and fear. A map is not a way to somewhere. A map is an instruction on how to look, read one of the last legible sentences. And then blank pages. Arthur, a man of facts, felt a pang of professional curiosity mingled with alarm. It sounded like the ravings of a madman. But Thorn was not mad, he was a brilliant scientist. Leafing through the blank pages at the end, Arthur felt a thickening in the back cover. Carefully, with the tip of a restoration knife, he opened the skin. Inside, in a secret pocket, lay a folded sheet of parchment. It wasn't a map of the area. There were no streets or rivers. It was a complex diagram of the architectural elements of the archives building itself. Here was Section C, here was the spiral staircase in the south wing, here was the old elevator mechanism. Symbols and lines connected these dots in a bizarre sequence, and in the center of the map, outlined in red ink, was a symbol that looked like an hourglass lying on its side. Below it was a calligraphic inscription, "Where memory ceases to be an echo and becomes a voice." It was a riddle, and Arthur knew he couldn't sleep until he solved it. It went against his very nature, against his love of order and predictability. But Thorn's legacy, the mystery of his disappearance, and this crazy but fascinating idea, all of it lit a cold flame of excitement in his soul. He decided to follow in his predecessor's footsteps. Not to find a seam of reality, but to understand what logical error had driven the genius mad. Arthur spent the next few days deciphering. He began to notice oddities. At first they were small things. He thought he heard his name whispered in an empty room. A book that had been sitting on a top shelf for centuries ended up on his desk. He chalked it up to fatigue. The first symbol on the map led him to the early cartography section. According to the riddle, he was supposed to find a map that lies. After hours of searching, he found a 17th century sea chart that showed a huge island in the middle of the Atlantic that never existed. When Arthur touched it, he felt the same inexplicable chill that he had felt from the diary. On the back of the map, he found the next symbol scratched into his head. Step by step, the map led him through the most forgotten corners of the archives. He descended into dusty cellars where Victorian court records were stored, and climbed into attics littered with theater posters. And with each step, the reality around him became more malleable. In the phonograph section, listening to the wax cylinders, he heard amid the crackling sounds the voice of Elias Thorn reciting lines from his diary, lines that Arthur had read only a few days before. In the daguerreotype department, looking at old portraits, he saw for a moment in the reflection of the glass not his own face, but Thorn's haggard face, looking at him pleadingly. Arthur was beginning to understand. The seam was not a place. It was a state to enter, a state to be entered into by tuning his perceptions, following Thorn's instructions. The map was a tuning fork, and the more closely he followed it, the more strongly he resonated with this strange place. The final symbol, a sideways hourglass, he had found etched on an old brass plaque behind a rack of demolition reports. The plaque read, "Utility Room 13, but no such room existed on any of the building plans. Except for the oldest, the first one Arthur had found in his own office. The room had existed, but it had been walled up nearly 100 years ago. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, Arthur found a wall in the basement that, according to the plan, corresponded to the entrance to room 13. The plaster here was newer. After a few blows, the crowbar fell into the void. Beyond the hole was pitch darkness and the smell of ozone and old dust. Arthur squeezed inside. The room was small, empty except for a single wooden chair in the center. But this was no ordinary room. The air here was thick as water. The light from the lantern bent, casting uncertain shadows. And the sounds. Arthur heard them all at once, the hammering of the builders who had erected this wall, Thorn's feverish whispers, the creaking of his own crowbar, and even the quiet future footsteps of someone who would come after him. On the walls, as on a movie screen, images appeared and disappeared. Here is Thorn sitting on a chair, muttering something. Here is the room completely empty. Here is Arthur himself, looking at himself from the outside. Memory here ceased to be an echo. It was a voice. It was a presence. "You've found it," came a voice in his head, woven from hundreds of other voices. It was Thorn and not Thorn. It was the voice of the place itself. You see, that is the greatest treasure, not gold but knowledge. The ability to watch every second that was or will be, like an exhibit in a display case. Visions flashed before Arthur, the fall of Rome, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, his own childhood. The place offered him the chance to become the ultimate archivist, an eternal impartial observer, lost in time. And then he saw another vision, a ghostly, translucent figure of himself, sitting in a chair through the decades, mindlessly gazing into a kaleidoscope of eras. He saw Elias Thorn, who had not disappeared, but simply accepted. He had become part of the collection. Horror and insight hit Arthur. Being the guardian of the past was one thing. Being its prisoner was quite another. Life is not about observation. Life is about participation, about linear, irreversible movement forward. That is its value. He had to ground reality. In the center of the room he noticed a stone on the floor, darker than the rest of the masonry, exactly where the clock was on the map. It was a focus, an anchor. Arthur grabbed a crowbar and hit the stone with all his might. There was a sound like glass breaking, but only in the head. The visions collapsed, the sounds died down. The thick air became the normal stale air of a basement. The stone split into several pieces. The room became just a room, a cramped, dusty, walled-up closet. There was no one in the chair. With a trembling hand, Arthur gathered up the broken pieces of stone and Thorn's journal. He climbed out of the hole and, working all night, filled the gap with new bricks he found in the basement and covered it with fresh mortar. He did it so skillfully that no one would ever guess that there had been a passage here. He did not destroy the place, he merely sealed it again. The next morning Arthur Penhaligon sat at his desk. The sunlight streaming through the high arched window seemed unbearably bright and alive. The noise of the cars passing outside the wall was no longer annoying. It was music, the music of the present. He returned to his orderly world, but he was forever changed. He knew chaos, looked behind the scenes of reality, and made a conscious choice in favor of his simple, predictable, linear life. He placed Thorn's journal and the fragments of the stone in a special metal box and put it in his personal safe, assigning it the inventory number Drawer 1 and marking it Do Not Open, Never. He was no longer just a keeper. He was now a guardian. A guardian of the thin, fragile line that separates our world from the abyss of eternal observation. And sometimes, in complete silence, he thought he heard not only the rustling of pages, but also the grateful sigh of a reality he had saved from itself. If you liked this story, support the video with a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what struck you the most.